This episode is brought to you in part by the Table Podcast from the Hendricks Center at Dallas Theological Seminary. I'm Darrell Bach, one of the hosts, and I invite you to join us as we discuss issues of God and culture, which includes anything and everything. Listen on your podcast app or at dts.edu/thetable.
This episode is part of a long series exploring how some American evangelicals tied themselves to the Republican Party. This episode can stand on its own, but when you're done, go back and start at the beginning of Season 6. In 1947, the Reverend Harold Ockenga went on a tour of Italy. He was part of a delegation of religious leaders viewing the destruction after World War II. Upon returning home, he argued that the devastation was the result of Europe turning its back on God. And for a second there, it seemed like Ockenga might bring some of that destruction home. First, there were the accusations. Supposedly while in Europe, he attended the opera, purchased cigarettes, and then resold them. That was the whole controversy. Now this may seem quaint, but Ockenga's background was in the holiness movement, where Christians were to be holy, pure, undefiled by the things of this world. All the rumors hinted that the famous minister from Boston was living a double life. In the process, Ockenga had to admit that while his character was upright in Italy, he did indeed sometimes go to the movies with his wife. The cigarettes he was seen with had been given to him for free, and so he passed them on to someone else. That there was the entire American hullabaloo. Yet, in Italy, Protestants were upset with Ockenga for another reason. Ockenga, along with other members of the clergy, had met with Pope Pius XII. Pius XII was an interesting guy. His predecessor, number 11, openly criticized Hitler and the secularization of Germany. Not a good thing for Hitler, who was trying to expand his influence. So when 11 died and number 12 was brought in, Hitler and Mussolini wanted to cozy up to him. And they had plenty in common: hatred of communism, a distrust of democracy. Mussolini had been fiercely anti-cleric. But once he got to the Italian parliament, he gave a speech calling for intertwining Italy with the Catholic Church, to make it a Christian nation. No separation of church and state. And why? The better to gain power if an influential group is behind you. In the early 1900s, Protestantism spread to Italy, in part because Protestants were focusing their efforts on reaching the poor. Italians who immigrated to the U.S. might return to the old country equipped with a new faith. After World War I, Italians grew uneasy with the power held by Americans and the British, and also that Protestantism was spreading to Europe, even as Catholicism waned in the fall of the Austrian Empire. Their solution? Use the power of the Italian government to persecute Protestants and stifle the wave of evangelism. That is why Italian Protestants were upset about Ockenga and other religious leaders visiting with the Pope, because that very Pope was persecuting Protestants. This whole mess trickled down to something you may never expect: to the U.S. presidential election of 1960, when a Roman Catholic, John F. Kennedy, was a serious contender for the highest office in the land. Books and articles like this one cropped up.
When we raise the question, should a Catholic be the President of the United States, we should not be accused of bigotry. It is a legitimate question, and to deny us the right to raise it smacks of the intolerance of which the questioner is accused.
This is from an article published on August 15, 1960, in the Church of God's Evangel magazine. It's a question that haunted some Christians in that time, Americans in general. Can the United States have a Catholic president? To our modern ears, as the author suggests, that seems like a bigoted question. In 1960, though, there were other considerations.
When we consider these limitations, religion is not the basic issue. Rather, it is the political action of the Roman Church. Religion is the means used to demand the loyalty to put the political action into operation.
What if, say, John Kennedy is president of the United States and then gets the call from Rome that he has to use his power to benefit the church, or silence Protestantism as Pius XII and Mussolini had in Italy? Now, today, that sounds crazy, but it was very much in the air in 1960. This was not the first or the only publication to question Kennedy's suitability as candidate for public office. In June of 1960, Ockenga himself gave a speech at his Boston church asking just that. Could a Catholic president separate his official duties from his beliefs? Or would that constitute a failure of separation of church and state? In the separation of church and state argument, who is being protected in the deal? The church or the state? or both? It depends on who you ask. A decade later, when the United States found itself embroiled in scandals involving bribes, wiretapping, illegal searches, and a break-in at the Watergate Hotel, the most famous evangelist in the country found himself backing a corrupt president. Billy Graham had done plenty to encourage the head of state to identify as Christian. Now, would his efforts to mix church and state backfire on the U.S. or the church? You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truth. Okay, so we need to spend a little more time with Billy Graham. I did a whole episode in season 3, but we need one more look.
Lord, do with me as you will.
That was Graham's prayer early in his career, before he became pastor to presidents and before the big crusades.
And of course, out of that then would come the final parts of his education, his call to preach in a local church as a pastor, and then eventually to feel the pull of the Holy Spirit to become an itinerant preacher of the gospel.
By the way, this is David Bruce.
I'm the executive vice president of the Billy Graham Library and the new Billy Graham Archive and Research Center
in Charlotte, North Carolina. He's been with the organization for something like 40 years. Mr. Bruce toured and worked closely with Dr. Graham and was a lot of fun to talk to. So this young preacher, Billy Graham, goes on to do these huge rallies during the 1940s.
That notoriety, that ability to preach in so many places, put Mr. Graham in to the national psyche.
And soon,
he met Mr. Truman.
He's consulting for presidents of the United States.
It would often begin with his knowledge of them as friends before they ever either ran for public office or certainly ascended to the presidency.
It was that way with Dwight Eisenhower, who was a general when they met.
He met Ronald and Nancy Reagan in the 1950s. He met Mr. Reagan as an actor.
This notoriety, as we'll see, was a blessing and a curse, pushing Billy to walk a tightrope between politics and faith.
So these things happened not by design, but often by we would call it the backstroke of his life.
By simply doing ministry, attracting large audiences, over the course of time, people are going to want to get involved. That's what David Bruce says. And this is coming from someone who works at an organization bearing Graham's name. To balance that out, let's read what one biographer said of Billy Graham.
Billy Graham enjoyed proximity to power. He liked being able to have a hand, or at least a finger, in shaping national and international policy, in helping a friend gain and remain in the White House, in abetting the defeat of those whose religious and political views he believed to be mistaken.
This is the story of a guy walking a tightrope. One of the founding members of the National Association of Evangelicals, which, if you'll remember from last episode, was designed to lobby for neo-evangelicals to gain access to radio waves, military chaplaincies, and similar things. Graham was not apolitical, and he didn't quite chase power either. Instead, he used his notoriety to do things like lobby for evangelicals.
He would end up, over the course and arc of his own life and his own life history, meeting 14 different presidents, 14 successive administrations, from Mr. Truman to Mr. Trump.
Quite a career, though not all of those guys were upstanding.
He met Mr. Nixon, very interestingly, in the Senate dining room very early on in Mr. Nixon's Senate history.
Richard Nixon served as senator from California. Funny enough, Graham actually met Nixon's parents first.
But they really began as friends. They spent a lot of time together.
The Grahams and the Nixons sometimes played golf. From 1953 to 1961, Nixon served as vice president under Eisenhower. Ike wasn't a fan of Nixon, nor the prospect of Nixon being president. In their 8 years in the executive branch, Eisenhower never invited his VP to visit the residence. Ugh. Biographer William Martin wrote about the Nixon-Graham friendship in his excellent book, A Prophet with Honor. Here is an actor reading from it.
Billy always found fewer faults in his friends than others managed to see. If they liked him, he liked them, and was inclined to think the best of them, and to regard patent shortcomings as little more than a failure to let the sterling character he was sure they possessed manifest itself with sufficient force.
He wanted to believe the best of his friends, and Nixon was his buddy. that optimism would blind him to the man's true character. Graham showed his support for Nixon's 1956 bid for president, and Nixon attended Graham's 1957 rally in Yankee Stadium. Billy nudged Nixon to demonstrate faith so that the voters could see and hear him, though he was often hesitant to do so. Graham said,
"There are many, many reasons why I would strongly urge you to attend church regularly and faithfully from now on. I am convinced that you are going to have the backing of the overwhelming majority of the religiously minded people in America. It would be most unfortunate if some of your political enemies could point to any inconsistency."
Nixon generally declined to demonstrate his faith in public. Meanwhile, Graham did more than just give religious advice, going so far as to suggest a VP nomination or to urge him to meet with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Nixon declined to meet MLK, possibly because of his Southern strategy, which we'll cover next time, but also out of a bit of bravado. He didn't think that black people would leave the party of Lincoln. After all, in 1956, 60% of the black vote went for the Republican Eisenhower. Why wouldn't they choose him, too? Nixon's first run for the big chair was against the Catholic JFK. Protestants of many stripes worried about Rome's potential control over Kennedy. In fact, the pamphlet read to you at the beginning of the episode was written by the director of the National Association of Evangelicals, an organization that Graham helped to found. They also released a letter to evangelical pastors drumming up concern about the dangers of Roman Catholicism and, of course, communist infiltration.
Public opinion is changing in favor of the Church of Rome. It is time for us to stand up and be counted as Protestants.
Similar concerns were expressed in Christianity Today, which Graham also helped to establish and, in full disclosure, serves ads to this podcast. The Billy Graham Evangelistic Association put out a flyer in the first edition of Decision magazine reminding evangelicals,
"We Christians must work and pray as never before in this election, or the future course of America could be dangerously altered, and the free preaching of the gospel could be endangered." Even
theologically liberal leaders like those of the Federal Council of Churches showed fear. According to William Martin, Graham himself waffled on his opinions. He urged Eisenhower in a letter to support Nixon because if Kennedy won and Johnson became VP, Roman Catholic Mike Mansfield would be in line for Senate Majority Leader. He wrote,
"The Roman Catholic Church will take advantage of this."
But later, Graham distanced himself from these comments, not wanting to endorse bigotry, writing to Nixon that he was for him, but not against Kennedy. In public, Graham all but endorsed Nixon, often saying things along the lines that he was the man for the job, but never quite making an official declaration. Of course, Nixon lost his bid for the presidency in one of the closest elections in U.S. history, and opposition to Catholics dissipated with Vatican II, the Vatican Council from 1962 to 1965 that determined that the Roman Catholic Church would now be more tolerant of other faiths, including Protestantism. Billy Graham had the ear of presidents, sometimes to give advice and sometimes to offer spiritual guidance to those on both sides of the aisle, even JFK. This elevated position meant not only holding rallies with tens of thousands in attendance, but also bending the ear of those in charge. But walking that line is just not easy. Soon, his public stances, his career in political circles, would have him backing a criminal, a man partially responsible for steering the party of Lincoln away from African Americans, whose team was involved in spying, corruption, bribery, money laundering, and breaking into the offices of the Democratic National Convention. I'll continue the story after these messages. This episode is brought to you by No Small Endeavor, the acclaimed podcast from Great Feeling Studios and PRX. In each episode, host and award-winning theologian Lee C. Camp sits down with courageous and impassioned people, like Hollywood legend Rob Reiner and civil rights hero Reverend James Lawson, talking about what it means to find true happiness and flourish in day-to-day life. And if you're looking for somewhere to start, why not check out the recent episode with award-winning journalist and best-selling author Tim Alberta on Christian nationalism's role in the Republican Party. Follow No Small Endeavor on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode is brought to you by Our Daily Bread Ministries, a global media organization that makes the life-changing wisdom of the Bible understandable and accessible to all. As a part of that mission, Where You're From is a podcast for those who believe it's important to stop and listen before we speak. Join us on each episode as we ask another Christian thought leader where you're from and discover how their life experiences and expertise, even if we may disagree with something they say, offers us important perspectives worth thinking about. To see our list of guests, visit whereyou'refrom.org today. That's whereyafrom.org. I'm Russell Berry, reminding you that it's not just about where you're at, but it's also about where you're from.
Welcome back. This episode, we're talking about Billy Graham, who spent much of his life close to power. Yeah, he kind of had to walk a fine line, which, as you said earlier, kind of nipped him in the backside a few times.
Well, it did. Because, we're all human, and so every one of these presidents is a sinner like I am and you are. Some were, of course, saved by grace, and others were still trying to find a spiritual meaning to their lives. But the common denominator in those 14 administrations was Billy Graham.
That's an important thing to keep in mind as we get into some hard stuff. Those in power are people too. It doesn't excuse their crimes if there are any, but they need spiritual guidance as much as anybody else. Like, for example, President Johnson.
Johnson wrote him a letter after he left office, and that letter is here in our archives. He says rather poignantly, Billy, you will never know how you lifted my burden by your visits. Well, that's poignant. We don't really know what all that means down inside. Those men had conversations we'll never know about. But to hear the president say, you've lifted my burden, you're helping me, that's a remarkable thing.
President Johnson attended a crusade, this one in Houston in 1965. Though Johnson apparently was a little distracted, Graham blasted Vietnam protesters, much to the president's delight. He supported Johnson's Great Society measures, which provided aid for Americans, programs that would be disassembled by Nixon and Reagan. Graham was nothing if not all over the place when it came to party platforms. As close as he was to the Johnsons, he still believed that Nixon was the man of the hour. Around Christmas 1967, Nixon invited the Evangelist to vacation with him in Florida as he considered whether or not to run again. Despite having pneumonia, Graham flew down. They studied the Bible, watched football, and walked on the beach, hashing out Nixon's next move. At the end of the visit, Nixon said, "You still haven't told me what I ought to do." And Graham responded,
"Well, if you don't, you'll worry for the rest of your life whether you should have, won't you?"
According to Martin, more than anyone else, it was Graham who convinced Nixon to campaign a second time. Again, Billy dodged and weaved when the press asked him who he was going to support. Still, it's hard to deny what side he was on. At a Portland crusade, he said,
"There is no American I admire more than Richard Nixon."
He offered the prayer at the Republican National Convention after Nixon was nominated, then attended the meeting to choose the vice president. Graham's choice was not picked. Instead, Maryland Governor Spiro Agnew got the job. Though he'd served only 1 year as governor, he'd caught Nixon's eye after ruthlessly putting down urban riots. Neither man had patience for protests. Graham also stated in an interview that he cast his absentee ballot for Nixon. Again, not an official endorsement, but, an endorsement. Richard Nixon's presidency ushered in a new era of civil religion, with the usual prayer breakfasts and such. The president expressed his desire to see the 10 Commandments read in schools, things to signal to the public that the government is seeking the face of God. The flip side of civil religion, of course, is that events like these open opportunity for leaders to play church while currying political favor. For example, Richard Nixon was the first president of the United States to institute a weekly church service in the White House. It began his first Sunday in office with Billy Graham preaching. It became much less about piety and more about creating another it place to see and be seen. Charles Colson, special counsel to the president, was instructed via memo of the
President's request that you develop a list of rich people with strong religious interest to be invited to the White House church services.
Future attendees included presidents and board chairs of companies like AT&T, GE, General Motors, PepsiCo, Republic Steel, and more. Of course, those people need to know about Jesus as well. But it's in defiance of James 2, which commands us not to offer the seat of honor only to the wealthy. Non-VIPs, like wives of POWs, were limited to 25% of attendees. Preachers were instructed to keep things light, not act like a prophet. They were sometimes invited for political quid pro quo, like with Fred Rhodes, who sought the presidency of the Southern Baptist Convention. A visit to the White House would make him seem like an important man, while also giving Nixon a bump with the 12 million members of the SBC. All of this to support a man with shaky credentials when it came to faith. Nixon, according to an advisor, didn't even believe in Christ's resurrection. Still, it gave Graham access. Remember, he liked being close to political power. And this access did not go unnoticed. Members of the liberal clergy criticized him for not urging Nixon to end the Vietnam War fast enough. Graham went a long stretch without speaking about Vietnam, until Reverend Ernest Campbell of New York's Riverside Church publicized an open letter to Graham, calling on him to use his influence.
We believe that the only way you, or any of us, can minister to the troops and inhabitants of Vietnam is to prophesy to the Pentagon and the White House, in the tradition of Micaiah, son of Imlah. And you, our brother, have been and will be the prophet summoned to those halls.
Graham often responded that he was not a prophet like Nathan of the Old Testament, but he did use his influence. Some modern writers critique the evangelist, saying he didn't do enough for African Americans, though he did push for integration at some of his crusades and arranged a meeting between Nixon and a group of black ministers. Apparently, they let Nixon have it for 3.5 hours. So went their relationship, helping each other. Apparently, though, Graham was not aware of Nixon's true character, the side of the president that, with the benefit of hindsight, we all know.
Well, remember, like most Americans, nearly all Americans, there's so much of that was hidden. And while things began to unravel for them, and there was a reflection in this country of the duplicity in that office, Mr. Graham, of course, was heartsick.
On June 17, 1972, a security officer named Frank Wills was working the graveyard shift at the Watergate complex. He noticed something fishy. He found tape over the door locks. Wills called the police, who turned up a group of 5 men. They had lockpicks, door jimmies, $2,300 in cash, 40 rolls of unexposed film, tear gas guns, and a shortwave radio. The break-in was significant already, but what drew national attention is that these men had links to the re-election committee of President Richard Nixon. In the following months, a litany of charges that's almost too long to believe came to light. We generally think of the break-in as the main event, but it was far from the only immoral act. There were lesser infractions like just icky shenanigans. Stuff like buying up thousands of copies of the Washington Post to fake votes in a poll for the paper. Then there were more serious charges. Destruction of evidence that tried to frame JFK for the assassination of a South Vietnamese president. Or when a defense intellectual named Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers, they broke into a psychiatrist's office to dig up dirt on him. This was the work of the notorious plumbers, Nixon's hatchet men. Vice President Agnew, himself a hatchet man, became the White House's attack dog against liberals, lambasting the Watergate Committee for McCarthy tricks and for acting on quote-unquote the misguided zeal of a few individuals. Well, it turns out that as governor and Baltimore County executive, he'd accepted literal bags of cash in exchange for government contracts, a habit he continued while vice president. These men ran on law and order, yet Agnew was given only one reduced charge of income tax evasion. He spent no time in jail and got a $10,000 fine, even though that was less than the IRS said he owed in taxes on the graft he'd taken from a single Maryland building contractor. The vice president was knee-deep in bribes and walked away with a slap on the wrist. That angst you feel about that? Imagine how it felt at the time. Trust in government crumbled. You could get more serious charges by breaking a window during a protest. When called to testify, Pat Buchanan, then a speechwriter for Nixon, revealed tactics used by the campaign. One mission was to ensure that Nixon ran against the weakest Democrat, who they judged to be George McGovern. He admitted to arranging fake demonstrations against Democratic candidates, planting letters to the editor in newspapers, having fake protesters duck into photographs with opponents to make it look like there was a demonstration going on when it was just one guy with a sign. Nothing illegal about that, perhaps, but it certainly erodes one's confidence in the electoral process. Then there was the way they financed the burglary. Some of it was laundered through a Mexican bank, and $199,000 was paid to G. Gordon Liddy for supplies. Money was hidden in wads of $100 bills stuffed into lockers in airports, hotel rooms, and telephone booths. John Dean, White House counsel, testified about his attempts to shut down the FBI's investigation of Watergate and arrange payoffs for defendants to perjure themselves. Nixon was found to have hidden profits from a land sale. He claimed California as his voting residence, but paid no state taxes there. Republicans, including Ronald Reagan, went on the warpath after all the negative coverage and blamed the Eastern press establishment, not unlike recent attacks on the mainstream media. Chuck Colson went so far as to threaten to revoke the broadcast licenses of the major networks if they didn't comply with what he considered balanced coverage, i.e. coverage that didn't make the criminals look so bad. And the list continues. The president's personal attorney, Herbert Kalmbach, pled guilty to setting up fake political committees in 1970 to launder Senate campaign contributions. Then there was Nixon's obstruction of justice, one of the articles of impeachment leveled against him. As you know, he had an audio recording system in the Oval Office, and the president stalled and stalled when handing over the tapes, offering edited transcripts instead of the originals, eventually leaving out entire sections or covering them with a buzz. Archibald Cox, a Harvard law professor, was in charge of the investigation, and Nixon ordered his attorney general and deputy attorney general to fire Cox. But both men resigned instead. The next attorney general followed the order, and then less than a half hour later, the White House sent the FBI to close off the offices of the special prosecutor, an incident known now as the Saturday Night Massacre, when the president ordered the end of an investigation of himself. The list goes on and on. My point here is to impress upon you how bad this was and how drawn out was the process. From the break-in to Nixon's resignation was almost 2 years and 2 months. Imagine the kind of mental burden that was on the country. I also want to dwell on the depth of the corruption, because there are people out there who want to downplay this event. Nixon himself believed that the chief executive could do stuff like this simply because he was the chief executive. There's a fascinating moment from an interview with David Frost after this whole affair was over, where Nixon says something remarkable. He plays up the difficulty of the era. Airline hijackings, intelligence agencies not working together, bombings, student protests, all of these stresses against national security. And what follows here is a recreation. The interviewer tries to clarify.
What, in a sense, you're saying is that there are certain situations, and the Huston Plan, or that part of it was one of them, where the president can decide what's in the best interest of the nation or something, and do something illegal.
Well, when the president does it, that means it is not illegal.
By definition?
Exactly. If, for example, the president approves something, approves an action, because of the national security, or in this case, because of the threat to internal peace and order of significant magnitude, then the president's decision in that instance is one that enables those who carry it out to carry it out without violating a law.
I know that's kind of a jumble of words, but in Nixon's opinion, if the chief executive deemed it a matter of national security, a president should have orders carried out without fear of breaking the law. The president, in other words, in Nixon's opinion, is above the law. The Nixon administration entered us into a constitutional crisis, where the executive branch tried to deny the other branches the right to check its power. It was more than just a break-in. It was an attempt to assert control. Some notable figures stood with Nixon. One was Ronald Reagan, then governor of California, and we'll get to him later this season. The other was the Reverend Billy Graham. He didn't participate in Watergate, and there doesn't seem to be any evidence that he was aware of any of it before the public was. But he was still supportive of Nixon until it was all but impossible.
As things began to break, Mr. Graham tried to reach out to his friend. He was basically cut off from Mr. Nixon in the final months of his presidency. He couldn't get a call through. They didn't call him. He would later believe that they were trying to shield him in some way, so the president did not return calls.
Graham's remembrance of this changed over time. White House logs actually show that the two men talked 4 times in the last months of Nixon's presidency.
He never condoned what Watergate was. He always dealt with it as it was. It was a sin. It was a transgression in this country's history. It was a rip and a tear in our fabric. But Mr. Graham never lost his friendship.
One of the peculiar bits of this story is how Graham reacted in public to the transcripts of the Oval Office tapes, which were published in newspapers. Many accusations of wrongdoing were made clear by then, and according to Martin, what he found there devastated him. He wept, he threw up, and he almost lost his innocence about Richard Nixon. Graham's response was visceral at first. and then odd. In the process, rather than talk about Nixon's crimes, he focused on his use of salty language and taking God's name in vain. It seems odd to us that Graham was shocked by Nixon's use of foul language, but many other commentators picked up on the same thing. Graham wasn't the only one. And the fallout from Graham's continued support is somewhat up for debate. I asked Frances Fitzgerald about this. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and the author of several books, including The Evangelicals. That relationship with Nixon was one that was fraught with some difficulties and certainly seems to have maybe hurt his public image.
Yes, it did, certainly in the end, because he kept with Nixon right through Watergate. He really thought he had to save Nixon, and he believed Nixon, that Nixon had never done any of these things. Again, he was trying to keep a middle ground, and Nixon was sort of promising him that. But then along comes Watergate, and it destroys Nixon, but it also really destroys Graham as a moral force, and for a while. And he goes off on crusades abroad. He spends a lot of time abroad after Nixon.
In 1980, while other evangelical leaders were vocal supporters of Ronald Reagan, Graham held back, probably because he'd been burned before, and we'll get there soon. He continued to participate in major crusades, as well as officiate at national events like the memorial service for 9/11. Graham was on the list of Gallup's most admired men 41 times from 1955 to 1998. If he lost any credibility from his friendship with Nixon, it's hard to quantify. It seems that Graham did have some thoughts about his entanglements with power later in life. He told Christianity Today in 2011,
I would have steered clear of politics. I'm grateful for the opportunities God gave me to minister to people in high places. People in power have spiritual and personal needs like everyone else, and often they have no one to talk to. But looking back, I know I sometimes crossed the line, and I wouldn't do that now.
He regretted when he crossed the line, and I think we can cut him some slack from time to time. I mean, if you were asked to give spiritual guidance to a person in high standing, wouldn't you? I mean, presidents, queens, kings, dukes, members of Congress, they all need Jesus as much as the next person. Of course, if that crosses into doing politics or endorsing morally questionable candidates, that tends to get one in trouble. As a guest on this show said in season 1, godly people should maintain prophetic distance when ministering to those in power. Like Daniel refusing to eat the king's food, we have to keep separate when we're talking to those in high status, or risk being unable to see the truth and call them out on it. It seems, for the most part, Billy Graham figured that out. Which brings me back to the beginning of this episode, where I discussed the role the Catholic Church played in persecuting Protestants in Italy in the 1940s. What did American evangelicals say was the problem there? The failure to separate the church and the state. The Roman Catholic Church tied itself to a dictator in order to accomplish its goals. While nobody claims that Graham wants to wipe out another Christian movement, as the Pope did in the 1940s, politicians and preachers make strange bedfellows, a theme we'll see a lot this season. Yet we also kind of want preachers to speak out on injustice as the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. did. We ask them to walk a tightrope, to be involved in politics without also getting soiled by their proximity. What do we really think about the separation of church and state, and when does it apply? When we're confronted with hard truths about those in power, like Harold Ockenga was when he visited the Pope, are we going to fixate on details like whether or not he did or didn't attend the opera, or are we going to be honest about the bigger issue? If a politician we back is caught red-handed, will we humble ourselves or get distracted by their dirty language? Are we seeking righteousness, or are we really looking for proximity to power? Special thanks to the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association and David Bruce. You can hear more of our interview by going to patreon.com/trucepodcast and giving a little each month to help me make this project. For a list of my sources, check your show notes or the website at trucepodcast.com. There you can sign up for the email list, listen to old episodes, and find out how to help via Venmo, PayPal, check, or whatever. I relied heavily on The Evangelicals by Frances Fitzgerald, who was also kind enough to join me for an interview. I also recommend A Prophet with Honor, the Billy Graham story by William Martin. It's well written and a great resource. Thanks also to all the people who gave me their voices for this episode. My friends Chris Sloan, Jackie Hart, and Marcus Watson of the Spiritual Life and Leadership Podcast. Truce is a production of Truce Media, LLC. I'm Chris Starrin, and this is Truce. This episode is brought to you by the Compelled Podcast. What would you do if you came face to face with a murderer sent to kill you for being a Christian? For Virginia Prodan, that question isn't hypothetical. Virginia was a small, petite attorney defending Christians in court in communist Romania. And she was really good. So good, in fact, she caught the attention of the communist regime. One day, a tall, muscular man walked into her office, closed the door, and pulled out a gun. He barked, "Shut up, sit down. I'm here to kill you." Virginia was face to face with a trained assassin. What happened next would surprise both of them. Listen to Virginia's entire story on the Compelled Podcast, where they find incredible true life stories of God working through the lives of normal people. Virginia is on episode number 31, which is titled, He Came to Kill Me. Listen on your podcasting app or at compelledpodcast.com.